Hey everybody, Brandon here, welcome back to another tournament game analysis video. This game is a very special one because it marks the first one played in 2023. Not only that, but it also marks the change of the format of how I'm going to be covering my games from now on. As you can see from the stats on the side, I have decided to include a few extra things. Most notably, the thing beside the computer, what does that mean? Well, that is actually going to be my career accuracy, all the way from my first ever game to my most recent one, not including this one until the end screen. Then you'll be able to see the updated version. Not only that, I have decided to get rid of the Canadian wins, draws, and losses completely and just match and merge them into just one thing. Now it is just total. It's just a total version. So technically you can say that I'm no longer counting FIDE, but the thing is I actually plan to play internationally in the future. I think it'd be really exciting to do, whether it's just in the US or in different continents, who knows at this point. But I thought it would be good just to get rid of that, because there might be events I play in the US that aren't even FIDE rated, which is quite common. So enough of that, we've kind of gotten those things out of the way, and it's time to now get in the game. So I was playing with the white pieces against FIDE master Alan Monroe. I played e4, as usual. We see the Carol Khan with c6. I played d4, d5. And I've been playing this move e5 most recently. I wanted to see roughly kind of how things would go in this direction, because I've been having pretty bad luck with knight c3 as of late. Not so much with this knight f6 line. I feel like I've found some comfort there, but mainly with these bishop f5, bishop g6 lines, it feels like black just gets too solid of a position. So I kind of wanted to change things up and try e5. And I think it was the right call, especially after you see the game. So bishop to f5, h4, and h6. So h6 was a bit unusual. Let me actually just move this thing over so you're not seeing that all game. So h6 is one of the two moves that are often played here. Of course, one thing to note is e6 would be a blunder after g4. Whether you go bishop e4 or bishop g6, it doesn't really matter. You end up in the same scenario where this bishop ends up getting trapped. So that's not the only reason why you play it, of course. That would be a bit silly, because if you only look at it at that perspective, this actually could be a weakening move. Instead, it's actually gathered towards controlling more space, specifically this g5 square. For example, if you play into the line h5 instead, which my opponent did not, you can easily find yourself in these types of positions, with c4 being played as well. And generally, white's best strategy is to try to use this square to the best of their abilities. Generally, there are some dark square weaknesses for black, despite having a dark square bishop. So definitely keeping that in mind is quite important. So, okay, h6 was played. And I was a little bit familiar with what to do here, because I looked at it, I think a couple weeks before the game actually happened. So I went g4, and then we saw bishop to d7. So I was a bit more familiar with moves like bishop h7, bishop d7 I hadn't seen before. So I ended up playing bishop to e3, and roughly around here, I was out of my preparation. And I think it might have even lasted another move or two, but generally it's just kind of a move order thing. So bishop e3 is not really the top move. Actually, h5 is quite strong. And there are some good uses or good reasons why this move h5 could and should be played. And we'll actually see some variations of that in the game. So c5, d takes e6, bishop e3, and queen c7, followed by f4. The position's about equal, I would say, though. And if we check the live book, black seems to be doing fine when we look at master games. Black has actually been scoring more than white, at least according to a smaller database. So bishop to e3 instead, just trying to prevent c5, or just kind of getting ahead of it. I wasn't really scared too much of h5. My plan could have been either f3 or g5. It's been a little while, but looking at this position, I think if I saw h5, then maybe f3 would be the way to go, just to make sure that this f5 square is covered. For example, h5, g5. You could also take on h5, but if g5, bishop to f5 is playable, and they get this back. But of course, there's bishop to d3, and we kind of enter similar lines, but there is a bit of a downside here, and this is why I'm not too sure if I would have played g5 specifically, is that after these trades, and something like either g6 or maybe even e6, sure, we do have g6 here, so let's just say g6 instead, and the sacrifice with e6, I guess things are actually working out, luckily. This is a very good pawn sacrifice. Of course, you can't really take it, because queen takes g6, and we actually just regain the pawn anyways. So, yeah, maybe this is actually a good variation. My apologies. Okay. Because when I saw this in the game, I believe I was looking at something around these lines, and I just thought f3 just to prevent bishop to f5. So, let's just ignore that from now on. But we've kind of looked at a little bit of what my thought process was there. Just going bishop e3. So, knight to d2. And of course, I'm not really too afraid of queen takes b2. My plan was just to sacrifice the pawn. And I thought I got a pretty good position after, for example, this move c4. Just trying to increase the development that's happening here. Of course, there is a little bit of an expansion in front of my king, but I don't really think it's hurting me because the center here is locked. So that's actually really, really helpful. So my opponent played c5 instead, and I couldn't calculate here. I thought it was quite difficult. So originally, I was considering taking, but the problem is after queen takes b2, rook b1, queen takes c5, I thought this was extremely annoying, because when I saw this move, rook takes b7, I was looking at bishop c6 followed by d4 moves, but then I realized that I'm actually just missing something. There's always knight g to f3. So this was kind of on me there, where, for example, if d4 even immediately, you just go knight f3 and you'll pick up the pawn with no problem, and you prevent any problems on this diagonal here after the bishop tries to come to c6. Whereas instead, if bishop c6 is played instead, there's actually this really fascinating move. You don't have to go knight gf3. Actually, it's better just to go queen b1. And the whole idea here is there's always subtle threats of rook takes b8. It's actually really not so subtle. For example, if we get knight to f3 and there's no way to defend this knight. For example, d4, knight g to f3, and all of a sudden, how do you defend the knight? If you end up taking on b7 ever, of course, this is not really advisable because the rook is just hanging in the corner, and we're going to be gaining more material as a result. Just because we gave up an exchange, then we win a rook, we're just up a full minor piece there. So knight to b3 instead. And the idea was I was trying to provoke c4, because I thought in c4 lines, if I go back to d2 and we enter these types of positions again, I thought this is fine, because all of a sudden they don't have this d4 push, so I don't really have to worry about complications. I think this was a little bit misguided though. And instead, after knight b3, c4, they could have probably just gone into this totally fine, especially with this move queen c3, take on b7, bishop c6, rook b1, and e6. And it's not a beautiful position or anything, but I don't really see how black's doing too bad. Normally you'd want to make expansions like f4, but of course this bishop's hanging, so it's actually a little bit hard to get out with the white pieces. This bishop doesn't really have an easy future to see. Same with this bishop on e3. The knights are going to be okay-ish, but even still, it's a bit unclear how white is going to continue their development here, so that's not really advisable. Instead, they take on d4, which is actually just, in my opinion, it just feels like a mistake. So after c takes d4, we take it with the bishop. Knight takes, I believe, was also possible, but I really like the bishop. It's because of this move f4 after. And then my opponent played a move that I was half expecting, but still kind of surprised to see. I'm not sure if you guys can relate to that, but when I saw this move, it definitely put me into a bit of a think. It's the move h5. The idea of h5 is, of course, to undermine this f5 square. If they can undermine some of the light squares around the king side, then maybe in the future, for example, if I play g5, then they can play something like e6. If I just kind of slow play it, maybe they even play g6 right after, and they can use the f5 square, for example. And strategically, this looks extremely dubious for white, and white can easily just find themselves worse. So I ended up playing g5, to be clear. I think f5 is interesting, but the problem is if you go into this, you can't take immediately because of knight h6, so you would lose. And bishop to d3, knight h6 anyways, just looks extremely unpleasant. There might be moves like e6 in the position, but then you have to deal with moves like queen to g3 all of a sudden. King to f1, queen to f4. So, yeah, things are just a complete mess, and this doesn't look good. It feels like white is going to be a bit more exposed than black there. So that's why I ended up going with the move g5, but there's actually a critical reason why this, I think, works. First off, the move g6 fails immediately to e6. The rook in the corner is hanging, as you can see from this bishop. And instead, if they play e6, which happened in the game, we'll see in a moment. But one of the better moves, I believe, is knight c6, taking on d4. And I was actually really curious what happens after queen takes c2, which is not a good move, mind you. But there's actually this fascinating move e6. And the idea is there's always rook c1 stuff in the position, but not really just rook c1. For example, let's just say f takes. Now, surprisingly, after knight f3, white's just completely winning. And I didn't actually look at this enough beforehand, but I believe there has to be something here. Bishop b5 check. Bishop b5 check just kind of finishes the game, actually. And the problem is you don't really want to go bishop d7 because takes, and then queen takes. The rook comes in as well. Like, for example, let's just show that on the board here. Takes, the king moves over to the c file. Then rook c1 actually just wins the queen there, so that's no good. So, yeah. Yeah, I thought knight c6 was interesting, though. Maybe followed by moves like e6, though. Not taking on d4 is also fine, but just not taking on c2. This would be a huge mistake. So, okay, e6, and then g6 here, which is just undermining this structure, right? It's if they're able to just play the move g6 next move, then I don't really see too much of a problem. For example, again, knight f3, g6, the knight coming to f5, it strategically just feels awful for white. So g6, you have to play fast, f takes, and I ended up playing knight to f3 here. There was also bishop to d3 in the position, but I thought that bishop to d3 might give them too many chances. For example, I think knight e7 is decent here, where after knight f3, knight f5, rook g1, there's even this move rook h6. It looks a little bit silly, but it was really hard for me to punish. Whereas in the game with this move knight to f3, again, there's always ideas of rook g1, but it's trying to give the opponent a chance to maybe mess up if they don't want to try to hold on to the pawn. And my opponent played knight to h6, which does let me just grab the pawn now with the move rook g1. Whereas, you know, if they play knight e7, like, sure, they're going to be able to defend it, of course, but it just gives them a bit more options. Knight e7, it feels kind of forced after bishop to d3, whereas if I play knight to f3, you don't know if you want to go knight h6 or knight e7. So I was pretty happy to see knight h6, rook g1, knight c6. I just took the pawn. I felt like that was just kind of necessary. I'm very materially minded. That's just something I'm, you know, stuck with dealing with, I guess. I don't know. It feels like it could potentially be a weakness of mine. But it just felt like, okay, if I grab the pawn back, it's equal material, and now I don't really have to worry as much about putting on an initiative. It's just like it feels like I can play things a little bit more positionally or a bit slowly without worrying about being down a pawn. So bishop h3, knight to e7, and rook g1 was played. I also considered rook takes e6 for a little bit. I thought this was extremely interesting and totally worth it. But making a sacrifice like this against FIDE Master of all things too, this could easily go wrong entering these types of complications. I think this is, again, totally fine, but not something I was comfortable doing. Rook g2 is a little bit better. Of course, it covers the second rank, helps defend this c2 pawn, very useful. But I just preferred rook g1. Not really a rhyme or reason to it compared to rook g2 or rook g1. I guess the one difference between the two is that bishop f1 is possible, and we'll actually see some really important parts of that in the game, or well, after the game. So knight to e to f5 was played. I played queen to e2, which is a funny move. The whole point of it here is if they kind of make a really slow move, like bishop to e7 is too useful. Let's just say rook g8. Not really a good move. Now we can actually take on a7 here. And the whole point is that b6 would normally trap the bishop, but now we have queen to a6 check. And queen takes b6. And we actually just win 2 pawns here by force, which is really nice. So that's something to keep in mind. Of course, now king b8 is the most logical move. And now I go queen to f2. So I'm just trying to provoke the move b6. I feel like it's a useful move to provoke. It's not completely necessary though, but it's what I thought was actually important. Now, I talked with my coach at the time about castling here, and I thought castling was just like, this has to be played. He also brought up an interesting idea of a4, which is extremely intuitive, but I think we came to the conclusion that this is just a mistake, mainly because of this interesting move, just playing king a8, a5, and just taking the pawn. Now, this is still fine for white, but the thing is, normally you'd play moves like this because you have the assumption that you can, of course, take on a5, or just something along the lines of getting initiative on the king side. Well, the queen side, I guess, but black's king side. But it's actually really hard to prove any initiative here. The more I look through these things, it's just really, really difficult to find anything useful. So came to the conclusion that, yeah, castling is just better. There's this idea I had of potentially rook d3 to c3, which I didn't end up doing. But unfortunately, we didn't really get to kind of play these things out because my opponent ended up blundering here with the move bishop to c5. Of course, this square is defended too many times by white, so this move doesn't work. Rook c I thought was a bit more ambitious, where we could play moves like king b1, bishop b5, bishop c3, knight to d4, play something like this. And there's actually this fascinating move, bishop to b4, where we can then take on e6, for example, and b5 is hanging. So that is kind of the cornerstone of this whole tactic. But yeah, so my opponent played bishop c5, and now, unfortunately, the game's just kind of already over. We take on c5 with the knight. This is actually pretty important here. We could take with the bishop, but this feels a little bit stronger. The reason why is because if you try taking on d4 first, we have knight a6 check. So you actually just have to take on c5, and it feels much better having a bishop here than a knight. There's a few reasons why. First off, we're threatening rook takes g7. So if they play a kind of silly move, it's maybe rook e8, there's actually rook takes g7, because if the knight were to capture, there's bishop d6, just winning the queen here. So tactically, this pawn is hanging. It's kind of hard to actually blunder that pawn, but things like this in the position are very good to actually take note of. There's also potential ideas of even just going rook g6, trying to take on h6 and take on f5, because again, this diagonal is just so annoying. Of course, these feel a bit more like tricks than anything, but the position's actually just completely winning for white. So instead, in the game, rook c8 was played, but after b4, my opponent ends up just resigning. So b4 is just kind of a nice touch where We're not really scared of a5. We can always just defend. And having this bishop here is just very, very annoying. Knight to a or bishop to a3 feels a bit questionable because there's all of a sudden this move, knight to e3. And even if we get bishop to d6 on the board, there's always moves like queen takes d6 and rook takes c2. Of course, this should be winning at the end of the day. If we look at the resulting position, we are up a rook, but feels like you never know if there's like a move order we're missing. So I thought b4 is just one of those positional moves that just kind of ends the game. And yeah, it turns out luckily I was correct. So yeah, following up, I would really like to play this move, knight to d4. Of course, rook takes g7 is a threat here. There's just too many threats going on. But knight to d4 especially would be nice, because then we're threatening to take. If they take with the knight, we can always just take. There's always bishop d6. This is the whole cornerstone of why we would like to do that. And even if we don't end up doing that and we just trade off these pieces, there's a bit more weaknesses for black than there is for white. So if we just kind of remove some of these arrows, because that's a little annoying to look at. Let's just say king a8, knight to d4. And it's kind of hard to even get this knight into the game without just allowing e-takes, unfortunately. So I'm actually struggling to find a way to do that. Let's just say, even if they get a best case scenario here of like rook f, I know this is a blunder because the bishop can take it, but let's pretend it's not for a moment. If they get like a best case scenario here, and we're gonna ignore the fact that this pawn is hanging, we'll just go like queen e3 and then like rook f7 or something. These types of positions are still just absolutely horrendous for black to play, because white is up that pawn, and it does matter in the long run, because in opposite color bishop positions where black's king it feels kind of permanently weak and white's king is pretty much just completely safe. Yeah, there's not much to play for. Moves like rook g5, rook g1 are coming. Even bringing the rook to the third rank and trying to target the a pawn is just really hard to defend against. There's just too much going on, and that's why my opponent ended up resigning. Now, I thought it would be interesting to go back into this position with bishop to c5. Before it, right here, I wanted to see what could happen if black were to play this a bit better. So let's go on to another game here, but this game is actually Stockfish versus Leela, and I put both of them against each other in this exact position we'll get to here. I put them against each other in this position to try to see exactly what the best plans were for both sides, because I think that this position is just not that easy to win for white. Originally, I thought that white had a pleasant edge, but after seeing all these games between Stockfish and Leela, yeah, my opinion's kind of changed a bit. I think that black can create enough problems for white in the meantime. So starting off, knight g4 is a quite important move that's not really that obvious. Of course, you have to ask, why can't you just take it? And I thought this would actually be the right way to continue. But there's actually this funny move, bishop to e8, and you're going to be playing on the light squares here, getting your bishop to a very active diagonal. For example, rook g5, bishop h5 anyways. And the best white has here is just taking on f5, where after e takes f5, playing moves like rook h1, bishop f3, and queen f3. You're playing this position out, which is fascinating and could lead to winning chances, of course, but this feels like a complete mess. This does not look like a clear-cut advantage for white, in my opinion. And if they don't play knight g4, if they go rook c8 instead, it's fine, but generally the engine just keeps saying knight g4, knight g4, knight g4, like every single move. Instead, if they try to just avoid that plan for a while, they can, but then they enter positions like this, knight g4, rook c1, d4, and bishop to d3. And now this actually does feel a little bit more pleasant for white. It's a bit unclear as to how the attack is going to continue, though black's knights are quite decent. So even still, when there's a slight advantage for white, it's not really clear regardless. So going back all the way, knight g4, queen to d2 is actually best. Don't take that knight. Because again, this bishop e8 to h5, you all of a sudden give it room to actually flex its muscles a bit, and it turns from a bad bishop to a good one pretty quickly. So queen c4, king b1, bishop to b4, c3, provoking this move the computer wants almost every single time. And after bishop to e7, yeah, really fascinating. Again, you just don't want to take on g4. You would rather, if you want to take, you'd rather take with the knight. And that's why knight h2 was played. Not even caring the fact that you could potentially win a pawn. It just doesn't care about that at all. It really hates the idea that this bishop could get active, or even this rook could get active. So instead, knight takes h4, knight takes g4, knight f3, queen to e3, knight takes g1. And white to move. Very, very fascinating idea. Bishop to f1. So not going for the knight. Queen c7, knight to h2, because this knight is actually trapped. But of course, black does have enough play for it. So rook d to f8, king to a1. This knight's not really going anywhere. You don't have to take it immediately. Queen d8. I was actually looking at bishop d3, but there's just knight h3. And again, this f4 pawn's going to hang regardless. So just taking it immediately is better. Bishop to e3, knight to f3, getting your pieces in the game. But this is what I mean. So if you play along these lines, and this is best play for both sides, after rook e4, queen g1, these queenside pawns are quite, or kingside pawns technically, I guess, if you consider only the right side to be the king side. But these g and h pawns are quite scary, and again, it's one of those positions that I just would not feel comfortable playing as white. But this is kind of the better way to continue. I'll show the rest of the game. This really interesting move, taking on d5 before bishop f4. There's no reason to rush it. Bishop to f4, queen to h1. Again, no reason to rush or anything. Queen e7. Now you take. Knight 2b3. And h4 is surprisingly one of the better options. This is kind of like getting into that computer territory where things just don't make sense. Rook h8, queen f2, g3, queen f3, rook f8, queen to c3, rook c8, queen d2, just a bit of shuffling here. Eventually, the queen makes its way to the king side and plays this move bishop h3, which is a bit notable, and then queen g6, which I thought was fascinating. Of course, it's keeping an eye on this g3 pawn, and it's taking advantage of the light squares, specifically the fact that this bishop on d7 cannot take on h3 without knight c6 check happening. So after king b7, queen g8 was played, and during the game between Stockfish and Leela, objectively this is probably just a draw, but interestingly, Leela doesn't actually find the move here and blunders with bishop takes h3. And this is actually just a huge mistake, and now Stockfish just finds a forced win. Queen takes d5, queen b5, knight a5 check, knight a c6, queen f7, queen a6, queen b7, knight takes, knight goes back again, knight a c6, and queen c4, trying to exploit the fact that there are discoveries. There's also a check here coming. The black king is actually quite weak. So queen f7 to avoid both. So if the knight ever moves in a weird way, then there is an exchange that is possible. And if you instead do a discovered check, you probably will end up having to trade regardless at the end. So queen a4, queen f6, rook e1, queen a6, queen b5, knight to b4, queen e8, queen e6, and the rest of the game isn't as important. Of course, the queen is lost, but this is best just to kind of shuffle around and then mate. So, yeah, of course, maybe I didn't need to cover this game as far in depth, but I thought it was kind of interesting to show, mainly because most of the games ended up as draws, and the only one that had a decisive result, it was just something that Stockfish saw that Leela didn't, in a position that's completely irrelevant to the actual opening. So it's fair to say that the position is equal, even if it does have slight preferences towards white at first. So yeah, that's kind of gonna cover it for this game and also my tournament game so far. That was my first win against the FIDE Master in an official tournament. That was really exciting for me. And yeah, I'm just hoping to keep the streak alive. That's going to cover it for all of this. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. All right, bye-bye.